exercise. There's no dispute. This is not a controversy. Everyone understands and appreciates that we need to engage in some type of movement activity. Problem is, 70% of us don't. But it's hard to believe, but if you engage in a specific type of exercise, you could actually be worse off than not exercising at all. We're going to discuss exactly what activity is and what those parameters are in a moment with a board certified Mayo Clinic trained cardiologist who specializes in preventive cardiology. And he's done a meta-analysis study that was published earlier in the year. It has been a pivotal contribution to the movement module I am creating for a masterclass to prepare you for the next crisis. So you're really going to love this information. It is, I said, really one of the foundational studies I use to compile my movement module, which is really important to keep you healthy, keep your life going, and more importantly, prevent the degenerative diseases that so many of us come down with.
I got into triathlons and I was, running, 5K, 10K races and occasional marathon. I was really, really fit and I was just pushing my body. And when I got to be about 45, I realized, I started to get palpitations and I realized like sometimes I'd get this aching after a really high intensity like bike ride or things like that. And I realized, wait a minute, like where did I get this notion like if exercise is good, like the extreme exercise in middle age is better? It's just not. And so I started doing some research, and sure enough, it's like it's quite obvious that you can overdo exercise. People who are from sedentary to if you exercise moderately, you have less atrial fibrillation. But if you're doing full distance triathlons when you're over age 40 or 45, you start seeing like a 500 to 800% increase in atrial fibrillation. I've always been a fan of strength training. The devil is in the details about the dosing. When you look at people who do strength training, it adds another 19% reduction in all-cause mortality. And that's like if you're doing the optimal amount of moderate exercise, which is about an hour a day. You should be moving at least an hour a day. When I strength train, I go to the gym and I spend about anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes. And I try to use weights that I can do 10 reps. After that, you're feeling sort of like spent and whatnot. And so if you do that, and it takes a couple days to recover from that, 2 at the most 3 times a week, that looks like the sweet spot for conferring longevity.
Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And you're in for a real treat today because I have Dr. James OKeefe, who you probably haven't heard of, but I've known about him since I was researching one of my modules for my masterclass on movement. And his was the most pivotal paper. It really changed my whole views on this. Literally, I started exercising in 1968. So I've been exercising for 53 years and I made a lot of mistakes. And if I would have known the information in this paper, it would have saved me a lot of trouble. And we're going to go dive deep into it. And why I'm so excited to have him on is because there was a question in his meta-analysis study that was just published earlier this year that has profound implications about resistance training. So I can't wait to discuss about that. But in the meantime, let's tell you a little bit about him. He is a graduate of the internal medicine residency at Mayo Clinic, and then he went on to do a fellowship in cardiology at Mayo Clinic also. And then he met the love of his life, who he's married to now, and now he's out in Kansas City doing some things. So I'll let Dr. OKeefe describe his background further, and rather than me elaborate on it and how he's positioned. But thankfully, the love of his life is also a dietitian, so he has a strong nutritional orientation in addition to preventive cardiology. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a cardiologist, practice clinically in Mid-America Heart Institute at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City. But I spend a lot of time with on research and writing and presenting various topics. And my professional passion is just cardiovascular health and wellness, well-being. And so your interests and mine align nicely along these topics.
Yeah, it's very unusual for that to happen. someone in for the traditional model, I'm usually vilified and scorned and viewed as the devil for the most part. And it's there. I can't tell you how many people like yourself who are so well credentialed and respected that I've attempted to interview and just refused because they went to Wikipedia and looked me up and they believe Wikipedia, which still to this day says I was married to a woman who I only dated. And it said, and we stopped dating like 4 years ago. So just shocking. It's not a credible source of information. But anyway, why don't we go into your meta-analysis study that was published, I believe, in July of this year? Yeah. So it was, I'll let you discuss it because I'm going to do a terrible job of summarizing it, but it was really pivotal for me. It was so profoundly powerful because foundationally, the core of it is no one's going to dispute how much that everyone needs exercise. If you don't exercise, we know what happens. The ultimate epitome of that is going in microgravity in space, which is like zero exercise, negative exercise. And they have to, I think it's like exercise for 4, 5, 6 hours a day just to maintain their bone, their structure. Yeah. So fortunately, just living on Earth, we get a little bit of exercise, but we need optimal exercise. The problem, this is the major problem, is how much do you need? Because many of us are really committed to being healthy as we can, tend to overdo it. And that's exactly what I did. And if I would have had the information to study, I could have saved myself a lot of time, effort, and grief. And you're going to have this because Dr. O'Keefe is going to explain it to you.
Well, yeah, right on, Joe. It's exercise is like if we had a drug that did everything exercise had, I mean, it would be by far the most powerful drug for longevity and preventing disease and improving mood and all sorts of things. But the question
actually, before we go in there, sorry for interrupting, but one of the curiosity questions I had, I think it might help frame your perspective on this, is there's no way you would do this type of study unless you were personally committed to fitness. And you look pretty healthy. I've never met you personally, but so why don't you tell us your experience, your journey with exercise?
Yeah. So my family thinks I probably have ADHD. I've always been hyper. I mean, I've never had trouble focusing, but I'm pretty active. And, I've always used exercise, like whether I'm nervous or happy or sad, or, it's like exercise is just has been like my coping mechanism. And as a kid, I loved basketball and I played varsity basketball and ran track. And then when I quit playing basketball in college and focused on medicine, I made a personal note that I have to exercise every day because this is super important for me. And somehow a lot of people have this notion that like if some is good, like more is better, like hammering the body. So I got into triathlons and I was, running, 5K, 10K races and occasional marathon. I was really, really fit and I was just pushing my body. And when I got to be about 45, I realized, I was starting to get palpitations and I realized like sometimes I'd get this aching after a really high intensity like bike ride or things like that. And I realized, wait a minute, like where did I get this notion like if exercise is good, like the extreme exercise in middle age is better? It's just not. And so I started doing some research, with I have a lot of connections all around the world, and in the clinical research community. And we started looking at this question and sure enough, it's like, it's quite obvious that, yeah, you can overdo exercise. And I had been, and I did a TED talk on it. It's seen millions of views. And I've just focused on this and also, changed my life personally too. I realized like exercise is good for you. And just to sort of echo your comments, Dr. Mercola, is that 70% of the U.S. adults don't get enough exercise. And they would be healthier getting more exercise, any exercise. In fact, the first 20 minutes of exercise that you do will get you most of the benefits. Even getting out for a walk is dramatically better than sitting on the couch, or sitting in front of a screen, or, sitting behind a windshield. We have a sedentary lifestyle. And if you don't actively fight to kind of incorporate movement into your day, you're going to be in trouble. No question about it. Just like following the standard American diet will absolutely get you in trouble. There's no question. But about 2% of people are overdoing it. Overachievers.
That's
like
all?
yeah,
Only 2%?
it might be 5%, depending on
we're both in that 2%.
Yeah, sort of overachiever, kind of like I say, highly active people, competitive people. And, it's probably because the world you live in, the world I live in, like I know a lot of people like this. I see patients like this all the time because I've written on this a lot. They come with AFib or accelerated atherosclerosis with a lot of calcium in the coronaries, or ventricular problems, and it can even shorten your lifespan if you get really extreme about it. But so
I would be a little more stern about that. I think it will shorten your lifespan unless you address it, which is why we're having this discussion, because we want to define the sweet spot.
Yeah, and that is the tricky part. Like I had a wise mentor up at the Mayo Clinic decades ago, and I'd be going out for a run at lunchtime, and he'd say, James, you're just wasting your heartbeats. Your heart has only so many heartbeats. It's like, and if you look out in nature, you can kind of make that case that like a hummingbird has a heart rate of 500 beats a minute, and lives like a year or two, like a mouse does, who also has a similar heart rate. And animals that have really slow heart rates, like a whale, can live 200 years. And if you do the math, it does look like part of the sort of programmed life expectancy, how many heartbeats you have. So at first blush, you'd say, well, then for sure, that I'm gonna sit on the couch then. But no, if you do the math, and it's a complex math problem, like you do enough exercise during the day to stay very fit, so your pulse is nice and low when you're not exercising. That's the way to maximize your heartbeat. But you don't want to be exercising intensely for 5-7 hours a day, let alone do a full distance triathlon. It's like you're just asking way too much of your heart. So there's kind of a sort of an intuitive logic about this as well. Like everything in nature, you're better off not in the extremes. And that's true with exercise. So and we've been doing a lot, and we have plenty of time to talk about this, but it's so fascinating that when you kind of drill down on what types of exercise really correlate best with longevity, it's not the maximum amount of high intensity interval training, or some of that's important, but more is not necessarily better for vigorous, intense exercise. Like where this recent systematic review that we did found, it looked at a large group, and this has been, when you look at all these groups, you'll see what I call the reverse J curve, where like from starters, let me like draw a reverse J. So like from people who are sedentary, once they start exercising, you get like a dose-dependent decrease in mortality during follow-up, and diabetes, depression, high blood pressure, coronary disease, the osteoporosis, sarcopenia, falls, all these things. You get this very precipitous drop down to a nadir of about 45%. So you can kind of really slow aging and improve life expectancy dramatically with exercise. But then at the very high end, the people that are doing the highest volume of vigorous exercise, they lose some of that benefit. They're not as bad off as sedentary people, but they definitely, on virtually every study you can find, they lose. And it's a small proportion of people, like we talked about, that where they will lose some of those benefits for longevity, and certainly for things like atrial fibrillation. We see a drop in atrial fibrillation in people who are from sedentary to if you exercise moderately, you have less atrial fibrillation. But if you're doing full distance triathlons when you're over age 40 or 45, you start seeing like a 500 to 800% increase in atrial fibrillation. And I think that's I was feeling some palpitations. I never had any AFib, but I have a lot of friends who have had just for that reason, just for excess training. But there's a fascinating study recently showing that a big study of like 1 million people followed for more than 10 years, and they found that vigorous exercise up to 75 minutes per day reduced the risk even up to not 75 minutes per day, but 75 minutes per week, or 150 minutes per week. Even that might have improved a little bit, where you have these reduction in all-cause mortality and other diseases. But then it plateaued out after that. The people that are doing 4, 5, 6, 7 hours of vigorous exercise didn't get any benefit, and probably from a cardiovascular standpoint, lost a little bit. But if you look at the people doing moderate exercise, and vigorous exercise, if you want to like define it loosely, would be exercising to the point where you're having a hard time carrying on a conversation at all. I mean, you're just breathless. You can't talk. You can't even hardly think about a conversation. You're just, you're really hammering it. So, but moderate exercise is like, you're a little winded, but you can carry on sort of like a conversation, but it's not going to be like comfortable, like we're sitting now having a conversation. But so if you look at moderate exercise, that is very clear that more is better. You can't overdo moderate exercise. We're talking gardening, housework, walking, recreational bike riding, yoga, like non-intense swimming. Those kind of exercises are pickleball is real popular these days.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, these things, like, more is better. Number one. Number two.
Let me just hold you there for a moment, because that is such a profound statement. You can't overdo moderate exercise.
Right.
Who would have known?
Yeah.
Which is exactly converse to the vigorous exercise. You can easily do it.
You
And
can.
we'll talk about resistance training, which is, I don't think you've discussed yet, which is even worse.
Yeah. So not only can you not overdo moderate exercise, at least the latest studies would suggest that, but moderate exercise improves all-cause survival better than vigorous exercise, about 2 times that. If you look at the people who are doing the most vigorous exercise compared to the people doing the most moderate exercise, the moderate exercises have twice as good a reduction in long-term mortality as the high-volume vigorous exercisers. So it's like, not only don't you need to be overdoing the really strenuous exercise, but it's counterproductive if you're trying. It's not counterproductive if you're trying to win your age group, or you're trying to set a personal record, or all that kind of stuff. But like, once you get past 45 or 50, like, exercise should be like fun, stress reducing, keep you fit, but like, you have to be careful not to get too competitive about it. And that's kind of to me, the most important thing is you need to find activity that feels like fun. That's sustainable.
In your paper, I think you discussed the ideal exercise. It's not an isolated or solo exercise. It's a social exercise. So rather than walking alone, you walk with a group of friends, or you're playing like pickleball, or you engage with your friends. It's this social community aspect of exercise that is so important. And you totally miss that out when you're in competition mode and you're training like crazy and wasting your time, effort, and ever, and losing the social aspect of life.
Yeah, Joe, like, we did a study that's been, that was written up in the New York Times in 2018 with some colleagues from Copenhagen. And there's this Copenhagen City Heart Study. They've been following 11 or 12,000 people for like 40 years now. Really long follow-up. Young to middle-aged people, and following virtually their whole adult lives. And we asked the question, because they had the granularity around what kind of physical activity they were doing. We asked the question, what type of exercise or sport confers longevity best? And they had a list of things they were keeping track of, like running, swimming, cycling. They're huge cycle fans. If you've ever been to Copenhagen, like a third of population commutes by bike to work. It's nice and flat there, and it's really amazing and inspiring. But they're also into tennis and pickleball. They do calisthenics. They had a thing called fitness club activities, which are grouped weightlifting and treadmill, elliptical all together. They had data on soccer, golf, badminton. They're big on badminton and tennis. So we looked at this, and then we did this complex multivariable analysis to find out how much time they were doing each sport. And I went over there to go over these results with them. We sat down and looked at it, and I looked at the first at this complex multivariable analysis. I said, well, that's too bad. This obviously is just nonsense. It's like tennis was 9.5 years, and badminton was like 7 years, and running, swimming, cycling were like 3.5 years life expectancy. compared to the sedentary people. I said, but then I started thinking of it. It's just your point, Joe. It's like the sports that are social, like, the number one predictor of longevity, health, and happiness in humans. We're such a social species, is connections, social connections. If you can exercise and make social connections at the same time, that is an absolute gold mine of a longevity activity. And so that means like even like walking with your dog or your friend or your
Mhm.
neighbor, or like pickleball is huge. I mean, you talk to pickleball players, like that, improves their friend group. It improves their mobility. They sleep better. It's a stress reducer. Before we had benzodiazepines and antidepressants and pain relievers, like play, I call it vitamin P. Play did, like prayer, did a lot of those things. You go and play and have fun. Like it's one thing, like we work hard all day, and you come home and then you go for another workout. Enough work already, right? Like you don't have to convince kids to go play. They just now, and adults too. Adults should be playing. I think you should find somebody to play with twice a week, and however you define that play, but play is so important for mental health, and it's the best way to improve your longevity from exercise standpoint. And those are generally, moderate exercise, whether you're playing volleyball or pickleball or basketball or softball or tennis or golf or, anything, pool for that matter. My grandson and I were, playing pool last night after we went over and jumped on the trampoline together. It's like the whole thing is move your body in a fun, playful manner, and make it social.
And that is such good news. I think the 70% of the people are sedentary. Some may be inhibited from participating in exercise because they see the elite athletes and all the hard effort they're putting in, and they don't understand that it can be fun. And
Mm-hmm.
it could radically increase your lifespan, not only your lifespan, but the quality of your life, and
Yeah.
reduce your risk of all these chronic degenerative diseases.
Yeah.
And you don't
You need to
hurt
go.
yourself.
Yeah, you don't need to hurt yourself. You don't need to go anywhere near a gym. You don't need a gym membership. You don't need to feel intimidated by, like the exercise addicts over at the gym, and but but it's but it's just hard for people to kind of get out of that mode. That's why if you could find something to play, that would
Mm-hmm.
help a lot. And then the other thing I'm a really big fan of, Joe, is activity trackers. I mean, some people
Oh
some
yeah,
people like them and some don't. But to me, if you can gamify that a little bit, like I have a Fitbit on one wrist and an Apple Watch on the other. So I love these kind of things. And
I do the aura.
Oh, the Aura is another great one, and I get into like a group with family and friends, and then we kind of have a little friendly competition about see how many steps you got. I mean, it really helps. The first step in changing anything is measuring it. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
measure your activity and say, oh, just gradually increase it. And there's a lot of good data showing that like for the average American gets about 3,800 steps a day,
Mhm.
which is not quite 2 miles, but like that's about 2,000 steps per mile, and for every 1,000 steps you get on average per day, it reduces your your like mortality by something like 10% or 15%.
Okay,
And
what's your take on the literature? Because when I reviewed it, it was seemed somewhat not controversial, but it wasn't clear. Some studies show that there was an improvement the more you get. Like you said earlier, with moderate activity, the sky's the limit. The more you do, the increased benefit, as far as we know. But what's your review of the literature? Can you
So yeah,
still get?
there's Joe. There's been more and more studies on this all the time, like using these activity trackers, because now
Mhm.
you're getting big data, like the UK Biobank, which is 500,000 people, and there's a sizable subgroup of them who have been wearing activity trackers and being followed for 10 years now. Um, so so clearly more is better, up to like you get the big gains going from these sedentary lifestyles, like 2,000, 3,000 steps a day, up to up to 7 or 8,000, there's a very steep improvement in mortality, or I should say reduction in mortality, improvement in survival. And then it continues to kind of trail down to about 12,000 steps a day. And most of the studies show that it plateaus out at 12,000. I
Okay,
haven't
that's
seen,
your now a result
yeah,
or
yeah.
conclusion. Okay,
And I
12,000.
haven't really seen the upturn in the J curve at 16,000. Some people get that, like I get like 16,000 steps a day, just again, because I'm so generally active. Um, but, but the, but there's another recent study that also looked at like sort of just little exercise snacks. We're looking at people who take the stairs, who do some vigorous exercise for just 30 seconds or 45 seconds, just like lifting something heavy, doing gardening, whatever, where you sprinkle in some higher intensity stuff. That also adds to the baseline of just getting steps. And when you think about our evolutionary roots, that's kind of what our ancestors do. They were walking, there's studies of hunter-gatherers where they would walk 6 or 8 miles a day. The male's more like 8 miles, which would be like 16,000 steps, and the female's more like 6 miles. But they were carrying stuff a lot of the time. They're carrying water, babies, wood, food, shelter. They were carrying all the time. And occasionally they were really exerting themselves,
Mhm.
felling a tree or in the final stages of the hunt, or so it's kind of, this stuff is very intuitive. From, if you think back about our deep evolutionary roots, this is what we're meant to do. And by the way, we were generally doing it with our tribal mates,
Yeah, social.
we were doing
Right.
it socially, so and to me, that's just, one of the joys of life is exercising, especially as a male. Females are better at sort of cultivating social networks on their own, but males afraid from work, lots of times don't have a real deep, like, circle of friends. And if they do, the best way to cultivate that and maintain it is find something to do with your buddies, hunting or fishing or playing a game like golf or tennis or pickleball or badminton or, anything really. Just whatever you find fun, I think is just so important.
What, I couldn't agree more. And when I was doing the research for my movement module in my master class, one of the studies I reviewed pointed out what the origin of the 10,000 steps per day was. Are you familiar with that story? The
Yeah.
Japanese pedometer?
Yep.
In the 60s. But it appears that they had no evidence for that recommendation. None. It was just a pure marketing. But it turns out it was right.
Pretty close to the truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody was probably pretty intuitive. They just had noticed that, that act of healthy day, that seems like, a good target. But you're right. It was just purely a marketing ploy for a mechanical pedometer back in Japan and, 60 years ago.
Now, some of our viewers, actually a large portion of the population, independent of our viewers, they're really tightly strapped on funds. So a fitness tracker like an Apple Watch or Fitbit, and I don't recommend the Fitbit, not because it's not a good device, it's because it was purchased by Google in 2019. And Google is one of the heads of the global cabal, in my view. They steal your data. They're taking your data to brainwash you for the conventional narrative. So I'm strongly opposed to any Google product, including Google Chrome, Google Search, all of them, Google Gmail. Stay away from Google. But where was I going with that?
Oh, the activity tracker.
Oh, the activity tracker, right? For people who can't afford it, many people aren't aware that your phone has a free activity tracker. You don't have to buy anything. It's your phone can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
you just have to wear your phone while you're going for your walk.
Yeah, that's the only problem. And obviously, I would recommend putting in airplane mode because EMFs are a real deal.
Yeah.
And I was just teaching at a autism event over the weekend, and this was called Documenting Hope. It was in Orlando, and this is a really good group because they committed to research, and they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to do these very detailed analysis of these autistic children, and the intention was to identify the causes of autism. And I almost fell off my chair when I heard the results. EMF was the number 2 cause of autism. Number 2. Number 1 was antibiotics. Number 3 was toxins, and number 4 was vaccines. It was crazy. But anyway, I thought it was an interesting tangent, just highlighting the importance of how important EMFs are. Now, if you're an adult, you're not going to get autism, but it just shows that it can cause neurological damage. So don't put that phone in airplane mode or out of airplane mode when you're wearing it, or put it in a Faraday bag.
Well, we should probably chat a little about strength training too, because I think that's
100%. That was the next step, 100%, because that was the what motivated me to contact you, because I had a lot of questions on, not a lot, but a significant one. So enlighten us, because it shocked me. It radically changed my exercise program after reviewing that.
Yeah, strength training is again very important. And if you look at the benefits, it will improve muscle mass and muscle strength. It will improve bone strength. It's a good booster of testosterone. It helps to improve mood. It helps to prevent falls. And the thing is, as we get past even age 30, we start to lose muscle mass. So, and if you don't do specific training to maintain muscle mass, it will erode, and you end up with what we call sarcopenia, which is not enough muscle mass, or osteoporosis. These are very, very common problems. Even people that have obesity, we call it like abdominal obesity with sarcopenia is a really common thing, because if you don't train that. So I've always been a fan of strength training, and again, my intuition kind of aligned with these latest studies in um, that when you add strength training to aerobic exercise, like we're talking about moderate exercise, and moderate exercise can often be a mixture of of moderate cardio exercise and strength training, like gardening, for example. One of my favorite things to do is gardening, out there digging holes and dragging trees around, and bags of mulch, and I mean, it can be pretty. You're using some muscles there besides just getting your heart rate up. But not to mention getting probiotics from the soil, and vitamin D from the sun, and mood boosting from the fresh air, and visiting with the neighbors as they're walking by. I mean, it's all good. And in fact, on a tangent, I think that, like, again, sort of like paying attention to what humans need is like that social connection. I think nurturing other life, like dogs or cats or gardens, house plants. These things are all, not to mention paying attention to your neighbors, and well, all those relationships are so important. But relationships with animals, like dogs, I'm huge. I often write a prescription. One dog taken for a walk once or twice a day, refill as needed. And I insist that my patients, especially if they've had a dog and the dog died, and said, I just don't know that I can do another dog. You say, no, like, your health depends on you, mental and physical health. But back to the strength training thing is, so again, the devil is in the details about the dosing. And when you look at the dose, when you look at people who do strength training, it adds another 19% reduction in all-cause mortality compared to the 45% reduction that you get from
So it's on top of 40%.
on top
So
of
59% total.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And that's like if you're doing the optimal amount of moderate exercise, which is about an hour a day, of moderate exercise. You should be moving at least an hour a day.
So that is precisely why I contacted you for this interview, because it's such a small amount of exercise that, how do you count it? Because there's so many different ways that you can do strength training. You could take a 5-minute rest between sets. You can do 5 reps. I mean, there's how is that calculated? Because it wasn't clear in the analysis.
It wasn't clear, and it is a little tricky. Again, the devil's in the details, and you have to use some intuition. I mean, when I strength train, I go to the gym and I spend about anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, and I do at least 10 lifts, and I try to use weights that I can do 10 reps. Sometimes I can't quite do 10 reps, like 10 pull-ups, or 10 squats, or there's a variety of full body weight, like strength training, arms and legs, and these are like lunges, and as I mentioned, squats, and we do, like, they're called man makers, where you do a push up with a barbell in each hand, and pull, barbell, but dumbbell in each hand. But in any event, like, you do 10, and then you pretty much can't do any more than that. Like, that's about as much as I feel good about doing. After that, you're feeling sort of like spent and whatnot. And so if you do that, and it takes a couple of days to recover from that. So if you do that 2, at the most 3 times a week, that looks like the sweet spot for strength and for conferring longevity. But like you say, some people, go to the gym and do one thing, and then they'll kind of,
Socialize.
Well, usually it's not socializing. It's usually staring at their phone. You know, it's true. It's like, you look around the gym, most people, if they're not on a treadmill or something, And again, hearkening back to that study, the Copenhagen City Heart Study, like as big as important as strength training is, in that study, the people doing the health club activities, weightlifting, treadmill, all kind of stuff, they had a very meager improvement in long-term life expectancy. It was only 1.5 years compared to sedentary people. Whereas, like, badminton was 7 years, tennis was 9.5 years, like crazy. So it's important, but the health club activities generally are solitary. You're lifting weights, you get your headphones in. People like they come over to like share a thing, and somebody looks at you like, get out of my space. What are you doing here? It's like the opposite of social almost, And so
Antisocial.
yeah. So the point is like back, and maybe I'll show this that your listeners can look at these J curves. By the time you get to be like above 130 minutes a week, you start losing the benefit. Your longevity benefit would be the same as if you weren't doing anything. And if you're doing more than about 3 or 4 hours a week, you have a worse long-term survival than people who don't lift weights. And I don't know why that is.
It's worse than being sedentary.
Yeah. And I don't know why that is. Like with aerobic or vigorous exercise, you're still way better off, even if you're doing a lot of vigorous exercise, way better off than sedentary people. You lose some of the benefit, but you're not worse off. And I don't know if it has to do with the people that are doing too much weightlifting. Maybe they're doing a lot of, steroids, or maybe it's like when you're doing really heavy weightlifting, your blood pressure does get above 200 lots of times. And maybe it's just too much work on your heart. I don't know what it is, but it fits with my intuition is that a couple of sessions of 20 to 40 minutes of weight training a week on non-consecutive days is a really important thing to add to your
But it's the key point and word you said is add. It is not to be done exclusively, because you'd be far, far better off to take that time and just walk.
Yep, absolutely. Just go for a walk, especially outdoors. Outdoor walking, there are studies showing that improving mood and even cognitive, like sort of functioning is better with outdoor exercise, especially if you can do it around like, some trees or body of water or, grass, it's really, it just settles our subconscious mind down and gets us back in the milieu to which we are adapting.
Yeah, and your paper, which is available free on PubMed, you can download this paper and read the whole thing. You talk about nature. Is it nature walking or some type of nature activity?
Yeah, it's called forest bathing. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But no, the group of exercises, that's if you're in the forest. But basically, being in nature when you're moving is the key.
Yeah, and especially like you should try to get. There was a really cool study done in the UK where they looked at the dose of nature per week that correlated with good health, and it was like you needed at least like an hour and a half or 2 hours outdoors. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go to a national park, but just get out to a local park or a tree-lined street or, and so that's like, when you think about it, like at least three walks a week, 3 or 4 walks a week where you get out in nature. And then the forest bathing thing is really interesting. These are Japanese people who are living in Tokyo, one of the biggest cities in the world. And they'll get on a bullet train and an hour or two later be at the mountains and in the forest, and they go hike around or even just sit, in nature and smell the pine and the fresh air. And then they get on the bullet train and go back home, and they show reductions in blood pressure and improvement in mood. And there's really, really strong benefits. And it's also benefits like that. I've really gotten conscious of this myself, is that from time to time, go someplace where you can kind of be in awe of nature, something that's like the mountains or the sea and just, one of my favorite things is when I'm swimming outdoors. I love to swim outdoors, is flip over on my back and do a kind of a gentle backstroke and stare at the clouds going by, and that is also very mesmerizing and calm your system down. There's something about looking at a blue sky, like listening to watching the waves or, looking at trees, just really like focus on that and take your headphones out and, and appreciate the beauty of nature, and it will definitely. It's been shown to calm your mood and reduce anxiety and improve sleep and all those kinds of things that are important for well-being.
Yeah, I think part of that has to be exposure to the sunlight on your skin.
Completely agree.
We know it has so many benefits. Vitamin D is only one of many others.
Right. As a
You-
cardiologist, Joe, one of the things I love about sunlight is even if you have sunscreen on, um, the you get this big boost in nitric oxide, which is the thing produced by the endothelium lining all the veins and arteries throughout our body and brain, and that increases nitric oxide, which dilates blood vessels and makes them more soft and supple and less likely to clot. Kind of, it's sort of like a Teflon-like effect. So it's super good for your whole cardiovascular system, body and brain, to get out there in the sunshine. And people worry about, oh my God, like the dermatologists are always like trying to, scare us about being out in the sun, like we're like naked mole rats, like you were talking about, like we're evolved to be outdoor creatures. You have to keep in mind the sunlight that you were adapted for. Like if you came from Northern Europe, your ancestors, then, in midday sun in Florida in the summer, you're gonna get sunburned and you're gonna get in trouble. But the point is that 7,000 people a year die of melanoma in the United States, which seems like a lot, although it's it's a disease that affects a lot of people. It's unusual to die of squamous cell or basal cell, but melanoma will kill you. So we want to avoid that, and you want to avoid sunburns. But last year, 108,000 people died of recreational drug overdose, mostly opioids, but other things.
I thought it
108,000.
was more 180, not 108,
No,
180.
it was 108. It was 108.
108? I thought it
It's
was
still,
higher.
that's more than all the gunshot wounds, motor vehicle accidents, and breast cancer put together
Yeah.
per year. I mean, this is and so that's a problem of like mental health. I mean,
No,
it's
there's
like
no question. Yeah,
that
no question.
disease of desperation, like get outside in the sunshine. It'll perk you up. It'll make you happy. Go play with your
Yeah.
friends. Go get a dog. That you won't be so susceptible to drugs. And keep in mind, yeah, you have to be a little careful about the sun, but you have to be more careful to like cultivate these habits in your life that keep you mentally healthy.
Yeah, that is the first module in my masterclass is sun exposure. So I'm really a big fan of that. And I want to come back to this, especially your comment about melanoma and sun exposure. But before I do that, I want to finish up the resistance training because, and you may not be aware of this, but I suspect you are because you're pretty literate on these things. But there's two types of resistance training. Generically, one is the conventional training where you're going to typically 70, 80, maybe even 90% of your one rep max, the most amount of weight you can move through one complete full range of motion, one repetition. And it seems like that would be most of the research that it was evaluated on. So you're really pushing yourself and you're pushing your body to its maximal physical limits. The alternative strategy is something that's relatively new. It's called blood flow resistance training, although it's been figured out 50 years ago by a Japanese researcher and just introduced into the United States in about 15 years ago. It was originally by this Japanese, the scientist developed a company called Katsu, Katsu, and it's a Japanese word for meaning additional pressure, where essentially, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the question I have for you because I really, really want your insights on this. And your thoughts, because you've got a deep knowledge, and I would really love to hear what you believe it is. But it seems to me that you could probably go longer because you're not pushing it as much. Now you'll be metabolically tired. You'll get increased lactate levels, but you use weights that are literally 70% lower than you would in conventional training. So, and it gets closer to the movement than really hardcore resistance training. So, what's your gut feeling tell you? Can you go longer than that? The time limits you were talking about, like 2 hours a week.
So, Joe, I'm just going to be frank with you. I know about it. I've never done it myself. I'm just really,
Well,
I
okay,
know.
you don't have to be an expert in it. I've been doing it for like 5 years, but you don't have to be an expert.
So what's your intuition? You think it really helps?
Oh, I know it helps. I mean, it's far more effective. You're such a strong advocate for resist. I'm sorry.
Is it kind of painful? I've heard that,
No, it should never be painful.
oh, okay.
You build a tolerance over time to the pressure, and you develop these metabolic adaptations. But the reason it's so beautiful is because you're using such a low weight. One of the main reasons, if you're going to engage in resistance training, almost everyone gets injured.
Yeah.
Th-
You
that-
don't do it at first. Yeah. You have to build up gradually.
yeah, but almost everyone does.
You can talk to a trainer, to kind of.
Yeah, even if you have a trainer, you can still get injured. So
Yeah.
it's like really, really hard to get injured with Katsu because the weights are so low. So I'm thinking because you're not really pushing this heavy weight and you're really getting to the point where you can't move the next day, that doesn't qualify into the same type of resistance training as that was analyzed in the study. And I think you might be able to get away with more. I'm not saying a lot more, but maybe closer to 3 hours a week. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah. Like I said, I just don't know enough about it. And yeah, being a cardiologist, it just makes you a little nervous about like restricting blood flow while you're exercising.
Oh yeah, no, you should be. The pressure is such that it doesn't stop the arterial flow. It is not a tourniquet. It is not a tourniquet. Just the venous return. Yeah. So the metabolic byproduct of exercise.
Lactic acid in the muscles and
the lactate increases really high, but it really causes profound benefits. There's no question. Yeah. But they've looked at this specifically. There's lots of studies that have been done on it, and there's no increase in blood clots. Mm-hmm. But that's an appropriate concern. Absolutely. No, but if you just go out and take a band and do a tourniquet, that's a problem. You don't want to do that. Definitely don't want to. See, the Katsu device it's a compressor, and it dials into a very specific pressure, so you can't ever shut the pressure off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one other thing that I'd kind of like to touch on a little bit is, people think of a sort of fitness, and there's an important point about that too is there's no question, and maybe you can show that graph from our recent review, mm-hmm. That shows that fitness is one of the most powerful predictors of long-term mortality, and mm-hmm. And so the more fit you are, the better your life expectancy. And so some people would say, well, that doesn't really fit with what you were talking about a minute ago when you said that vigorous exercise after about 75 to 150 minutes a week, you really don't get further benefit. And at real high levels, like several hours a week, you can lose some of the benefit. So you'd think that more is better for vigorous exercise for getting fit. And so that's a bit of a paradox. The way I resolve that is to think that there's a lot of different things in fitness. Like, if you're overdoing exercise, I have a good friend who's a very good cyclist, and he's about 65, and he says, he's like the last man standing in his age group doing competitive cycling, because it's like you get all these injuries, and that's what the last thing you want to do is go and injure yourself and then become sedentary. It's like you want to try to maintain fitness, which you do with this multifaceted approach: some play, some outdoor exercise, some strength training, lots of walking, gardening, getting a dog, playing with your friends. Like I grew up in North Dakota near the Canadian border, and my mother used to tell us all the time as kids, she said, go outside and play with your friends, and I don't want you to see till lunch, and that's what I tell my patients. Go outside, play with your friends, and try to do it a few times a week anyway. But it's like I think that it's really important to have that multifaceted exercise, and also to eat right, and to get your sleep, and to avoid substance abuse, and those things, and maintain an optimal body composition. And those things confer fitness too. So that fitness is not just about like hammering vigorous exercise. You want to get plenty of exercise, but you also need to pay attention to those other things. But there's another element to fitness. So we've talked about cardio, we've talked about vigorous and moderate exercise, we talked about strength training, mm-hmm. But there's also balance is part of fitness. A lot of people lose their balance and fall, and that's a common cause of morbidity and mortality in older people. And also like body composition and flexibility. right? And so things like yoga or Tai Chi are another really good thing. And that's a group activity that tends to, improve mood and make friends uh, and cultivate a sense of well-being physically and mentally. But there's a really interesting test called the sit rise test that we talked about in
Mm.
the paper too, and it's kind of tricky. Like if you're going to try this, it sounds real simple. You're just standing and then you like put your ankle one foot in front of the other, so your ankles are crossed, and then you squat down, sit down, and then you stand back up. And if you can do that without touching elbow or hand or down
Does
to
your
the
butt
floor,
hit the floor?
yeah, your butt hits the floor,
So you're sitting on the floor.
sitting on the floor, and your feet are up, at least off the floor, just for even a millisecond. So you're sitting all the way down, and then
Mhm.
you stand back up. If you can do that, if you can do that without touching your hand, and then you lose 1 point for each hand or elbow that goes down. If you have to get on all four to get down, and then get on all four to get back up, then
Sad.
and for a lot of people, that's the reality. Okay,
Yeah.
you'd get you get -4 for going down and -4 for coming up. 10 is a perfect score if you can sit down and stand up without using your hands or your elbows or your knees. That's a 10. If you can do that in this study of 2,000 people followed for 7 years, like virtually, I think there was one or two people who died during that study. It makes you almost bulletproof. Even if you can get a score of 8, which put one hand down on the way down and one hand up the way up. I mean, in other words, that simple test, which is a test of flexibility, strength, balance, body composition. If you have
Mhm.
if you have a big belly, it's gonna be
Yeah, it's not. It's going to be really hard. Yeah.
so that is as almost as powerful as any test that we could do to predict lung. And by the way, it's very trainable. It's you can practice this and get better at it. And it just speaks to the fact that fitness is a multifaceted thing, and you need to work on all those different things.
All right. Well, let's pivot to the another component of that, which is the diet. It's particularly appropriate because your wife is a nutritionist, and that's why you're in Kansas City and
Yep.
not in Mayo Clinic, probably a professor of medicine at Mayo. So the comp- reason I wanted to pivot there is that there's a connection between the melanoma, which I wanted to get back to, because I've studied the research on the vitamin D and written papers on it, and that's clearly one of the concerns. And I couldn't agree with you more. You really never want to get sunburn, but what causes sunburn and what causes melanoma? There doesn't appear to be any direct connection between sunlight and melanoma. In fact, most of melanomas are in non-sun exposed areas of the skin. What does increase is basal and squamous cell carcinoma. No question about it. And I don't know the death rates from that. It's really hard to die from that because it's so obvious and easily treatable. But nevertheless, people die from it. But the question becomes, because whatever causes sunburn is likely contributing to the cancers. And the common denominator, as far as I can tell, is the excess of seed oils in the diet, more specifically omega-6 fats, and more specifically than that, a specific fatty acid called linoleic acid, which is 18 carbon fat. And it's a PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it's predisposed to oxidative stress. So when you have sunlight in shining on your skin, and their skin is loaded with high levels of linoleic acid, and most people are now today because the levels we have are exponentially higher than they were 100 years ago, exponentially higher. And that is basically what is the precursor, the highest risk factor for getting cancer in general, but specifically skin cancer, which is the most common cancer in the United States, is skin cancer. Most people die from it, but it's still the most common cancer. I think the most common cancer women die from is clearly breast cancer. I don't know. I forget what it is for men, either prostate or colon, maybe lung. I don't know, but it's up there. But anyway, when you lower the linoleic acid, you radically reduce your risk of not only sunburn, and this is well documented, but also skin cancers. It goes away. And I live in Florida, and I'm pretty much out on the beach every day for an hour at solar noon. At solar noon. And I never wear sunblock, never wear sunblock. My vitamin D levels were consistently near or over 100 nanograms per milliliter. And
Without a supplement?
without a supplement, I haven't taken a supplement in 15 years,
Wow.
vitamin D supplement. No, Yeah. So, you have to eat well to do that too. And you need enough magnesium, and vitamin K too, because those are all cofactors for making sure that your body is able to produce the vitamin D. But I just wanted to let you know that, if you lower linoleic acid, you can, your fear, which is appropriate. I mean, there's a reason people get sunburn, a reason people get skin cancer, because I don't think our ancestors did hardly at all. They really didn't. They weren't dying of cancer. And this is, I would like to get your comment, because it's really uncommon for me to connect with a high level cardiologist like yourself. But as I was putting together my paper, because I wrote a paper on linoleic acid, a narrative review, about the same time your paper was published, maybe a little earlier. And where was I going with the literature I looked at was the incidence of heart disease prior to 1900 was very, very low. I mean, it almost didn't exist in the United States.
Rarely.
And in fact, the first reported case of heart attacks, legitimate heart attacks in the United States was 1912. I think James Herrick reported it. That's 110 years, 11 years ago. I mean, it didn't exist. We're going from a disease that didn't exist to essentially the number one killer of most adults. That's in a century. In a century. That's pretty. I mean, did you ever think, what's your explanation for that? Because, I mean, there clearly is not genetics. Genes don't change in a few generations.
No.
And it's not exercise. It can't be exercise. Can't explain it.
No, it's a multifactorial thing, obviously, but a big part of it is that our environment, our food environment, our movement environment, the amount of stress, our social structure, all those things are so drastically different. Cholesterol levels are much higher. If you look at pictures of people from back then, there's no obesity. I mean, like even in medical school, and at the medical school, they always talked about, the average 70 kilogram man, which is 154 pounds, which is, skinny by today's standards. That's about what I am. But, that was the norm. And now the norm, 72% of people are overweight or obese in America. So, and it's not their fault. It's just this, this food environment we live in and all the marketing and everything. So it's a complex thing. But it does speak to the fact that, like longevity, heart disease, all these things, genetics are not the most important thing. By far, the most important thing is your lifestyle, diet, exercise, sleep, those kinds of things, getting sunshine, gardening, getting a dog, these are the things that will make the difference in the long run. And you want to know what your blood pressure is and know what your lipids are and that kind of stuff. But the most important thing that has gone so badly in the last 100 years, and again, nobody's fault, but it's just the environment we live in. We're victims of our own success. We can afford cars. We don't have to walk places. We don't have to take stairs. We don't have to build things or carry things. And we don't, we sit in front of these smart computers and we eat all this, tasty, sugar, added sugar, refined feed oils. So it's the combination of these lifestyle factors, which are, highly modifiable. Like, you just have to take the path less traveled. You have to make a point to prioritize these types of exercise we're talking about, to prioritize avoiding all that processed food with the refined seed oils and all that junk food and the added sugar. This is will make the difference for mental health and physical health and longevity and immunity and all that.
I couldn't agree more. And usually the simplest recommendation to adjust your lifestyle, because it's really much covers almost the whole thing, is to avoid all processed foods, because that's where the stuff is problem. All processed foods. And very few physicians will argue with that. But if you do that, that almost solves the problem. There's a lot of other things that you have to fine tune, but that's the number one rule. Number one rule.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's fat eating broccoli and nuts and fish and
red
meat.
You could. I would argue that you could get fat eating nuts, because nuts, especially, in my view, I'm biased. I'm really a strong proponent of linoleic acid being the primary etiology of most diseases, cancer, obesity. Obesity, interestingly, at the same time when heart disease didn't exist, there was still 1% of the population, 1%, 1,000 people of 100,000 were obese back then. So even though 45% are obese today, heading towards 50%, that's only a 45% increase. But when you go from maybe 70 people out of 100,000 to 30%, that's like 5 million times increase. 5 million times of heart disease. It's like mind boggling.
Yeah.
It's just so shocking. But anyway, getting those, the reason the amount of linoleic acid in people's tissue is as I mentioned, 10 times higher. It's like 12% is on average, and it's supposed to be under 2%. Under 2%. So it's almost exponentially, but it's still, and it's the primary source of calories, linoleic acid. So it's in the tissues. So even any additional source of linoleic acid, when you're loaded with this stuff and you haven't engaged in a regular process or a regular strategy of eliminating processed foods from your diet, it's going to make it worse. So nuts are loaded with linoleic acid, except for macadamia. So you've got it. I mean, that's what you don't have to avoid them like the plague. But if you haven't like pounds of nuts a day, it's a problem. It's going to just put a load of omega-6 in your diet, in your tissue, actually. So anyway, so yeah, it's because your specialty is preventive cardiology, right?
Right.
So what do you when a patient sees you, what is your strategy? What is your approach? I mean, obviously you do a workup and everything, but what is your recommendation?
Cardio Wellness Clinic, the Dubai Cardio Wellness Clinic, and we also have the Cardiometabolic Clinic. And so we look at people, and I'm in a group of cardiologists. There's 67 of us, and 50 nurse practitioners. So it's a really big group, and so there's a lot. And I'm the only one who's really passionate and about the prevention, because there's so much work to be done with stents and pacemakers and ablations and all that stuff. But and that's important too. But prevention is just so foundational and fundamental, and it works so well these days. We really know. And so we get people in here. We often will do a cardio scan, which is a low-level CT scan. Just look for
what's the radiation dose on this, and how do people find that locally?
We call it a cardio scan, but it's like CT coronary calcium screening. It's low dose. If you go to a place with modern machines, that's like it'll be about 1 millisievert, which it's like in Florida you get about 3.5 millisieverts a year just from cosmic radiation and background radiation.
What is a chest X-ray?
Chest X-ray would be quite a lot less than 1 millisievert.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. But this would be this would still be like, say, living in Denver, you'd get 5.5 millisieverts a year. So.
Wow. So it's still acceptable.
So it's acceptable. You wouldn't want to be getting this all the time, but like it's a very limited CT scan, just looking at the heart. I call it like the mammogram for the heart. You ought to get one for.
But how do you find it locally? How do you find that?
Around, you could, on the internet, you could find people doing this. We charge $50 for it. We use.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Really?
Just because. You don't know about this atherosclerosis until it blows up. With a stroke or a heart attack or sudden death, and it's so modifiable. So,
do you think that is in your mind? Is that the best screen for atherosclerosis?
Yeah, that's the best.
It is
most easily proven screen. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's what I thought. But it's nice to have that confirmed. Yeah. And what it would be an acceptable score in your mind? And is it?
Zero is normal.
Zero is normal. Okay, it should be 0.
Our arteries should be soft and supple and smooth and no calcium. The old-fashioned term for atherosclerosis was hardening of the arteries, and it is pretty apt as the disease progresses. It gets calcified. These soft, supple, tubes turn into these rigid pipes, crusty pipes that are all inflamed. And so, I mean, the lower the better. We don't really have therapies to reduce the calcification. In fact, statins, if anything, accelerate the calcification, even though they help to reduce risk of heart attack and stroke and cardiovascular death. So we, and the record I've seen, and I've probably read 150,000 of these scans myself. We do, 40 of them a day, and it's a pretty simple reading thing. But the highest I've seen is 13,500. Like. Less than 100 is pretty mild. 100 to 400 is moderate. 400 to 1,000 is significant, and above 1,000 severe. you know, a lot of people have this and don't know about it, and so it's a good tool to use.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It's really good. So a good screen, don't do it regularly.
No, I mean that
You
if
know,
you have a
and with
zero
respect,
score, we'll repeat it in 5 years, you know, just to see. And if you have a high score, like I mean, sometimes I will repeat it, but you know, if you have a high score, we just need to be aggressive about getting these risk factors.
what's the most aggressive resolution you've seen or amazing success story with an intervention? I mean, going from like
You know,
1,000 down to zero.
someone go from 1400 to 1200, something like that, and you know,
That's so
that's
no one's going from 1,000 to zero.
no, never happened, never happened.
What's the biggest reduction to zero you've ever seen?
Um,
It doesn't happen. Once you're up there, you just can't get back to
Well,
zero.
if you have little specs and you do everything right, you can, you know, but this changes really drastic changes. I've seen it go from 10 or 20 to zero.
Okay.
So,
Thank you for painting the parameters and the guidelines around
yeah.
how to analyze it.
And Joe, the most important thing about plaque is not the calcium. That's not what causes the heart attacks. It's like
Mhm.
it's the cholesterol that gets underneath the surface of the
Mhm.
intima, the oxidized LDL that gets inflamed, and then it's like a zit on our face that we
Mhm.
had as teenagers. At least I did. They get this white head, and it gets red and inflamed, and then the skin overlying dermis thins out, and that ruptures and drains. And when it's on the skin, it'll heal that way. But in the arteries, when you have a zit that full of pus and triglyceride and oxidized LDL, it's it's very sort of thrombogenic, and it ruptures, and then platelets adhere to it over, and it can propagate to occlude the vessel altogether, and that's how you have a heart attack or a stroke. So we want to get that oxidized LDL and triglycerides out of the surface of the arteries, and that's where if we get the cholesterol down and you know eat that diet we're talking about, and follow these lifestyle things, you can really make a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
progress.
yeah. So I'm just curious. There were 67 other cardiologists in your
Yeah,
practice.
yeah.
So is the title of the practice preventive cardiology, or is that
Oh
your
no, no, no,
subset?
no, no. I'm in the. It's called the St. Luke's of Kansas City, Mid America
Okay,
Heart
so
Institute.
you're a subset of that preventive cardiology.
Yeah, I mean, I just work in the group, and I round in the hospital, and I read scans, and I'm a general cardiologist.
You don't
But
do any interventional cardiologists like.
I was trained in it, but I yeah, really became passionate about prevention instead because
Wow.
I think it's a neglected area that's so effective. I mean, this is just so modifiable, this disease, and so yeah,
It's definitely an anomaly. You're an anomaly.
uh,
Congratulations for being a renegade.
thanks, Joe, and it's been great chatting with you. In fact, they're texting me over at the hospital now, so I'm gonna have to get going. But
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much. You keep up the good work.
yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks.
Okay. Bye now.
Okay, bye.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.